I was 12 when the cemetery gate sighed open. It did not swing wide with a bang. It groaned, a long, low protest of rusted metal against stone. I stood there, hand hovering in the stagnant air, watching the gap grow. The iron was cold, biting into my skin even before I applied pressure. The sound seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes, traveling up my shins and settling in the base of my skull. Beside me, the others held their breath. We had come for the thrill of the forbidden, but as the gap widened, the thrill vanished. The darkness behind the gate was not empty. It felt thick, pressurized, like water held back by a crumbling dam. A sudden draft pulled past us, smelling of damp earth and something sweet, like wilting lilies. I looked back at the road, at the world of street lamps and living things, then turned toward the black maw of the path ahead. The gate stopped moving. It hung there, a jagged frame held open by nothing. I took the first step. The gravel crunched under my weight, a sharp, intrusive sound that echoed far too long in the unnatural silence. We followed, one by one, leaving the safety of the night behind. Once inside, I turned back to pull the gate shut, to reclaim some sense of order. My hand found the heavy iron link, but there was no tension. The chain that once bound the two halves together lay in the dirt, its ends frayed and jagged, as if bitten through by something with immense, grinding force. I lifted the metal. It was heavy, dead weight in my palm. The padlock was missing entirely. The shackle snapped like a twig. Jaden reached over my shoulder, his fingers brushing the broken loop. He did not say a word, but the way he pulled his hand back told me everything. This was not a gate meant to be opened by visitors. It was a cage that had been forced from the inside. We stood there for a long moment, the silence of the cemetery pressing against our ears. I dropped the chain. It hit the ground with a dull, final thud that seemed to signal the end of our retreat. We could not lock it. We could not leave it as we found it. The boundary between the world we knew and the rot of this place was gone. I looked at Liam and Mia. Their faces were pale, illuminated only by the faint, flickering glow of the path ahead. We had no choice but to keep moving deeper. We pushed forward, the beam of my flashlight, cutting a narrow, shaky path through the absolute dark. It hit the first marker, then the next, and the light seemed to stick to the stone. These were not the tidy, well-kept monuments of the town's main square. These headstones were warped, leaning at impossible angles, their edges eroded into jagged, rotting teeth that seemed to gnaw at the very air. As we moved, the light caught the texture of the lichen and the deep, unnatural fissures in the granite. They looked less like memorials and more like protrusions of bone rising from the soil, waiting for something to emerge. Jaden swept his light to the left, and the beam caught the underside of a fractured slab. It was slick with a dark, wet residue that shimmered even in the weak glow. I stopped, my own light locking onto a row of smaller, crooked stones that seemed to track our movement. The silence was absolute, yet the visual landscape felt hungry. Every time the light shifted, the shadows between the stones danced, creating the illusion of movement. It felt as if the cemetery was not just a collection of graves, but a single massive mouth, and we were walking directly into its throat. We stood still, listening to the hum of our flashlights, surrounded by the jagged gray teeth of the dead. We moved past the row of jagged markers, seeking a path that felt less like a throat and more like a trail. The deeper we ventured, the more the environment shifted. The air grew thin, losing its density until every breath felt like inhaling dry, powdered dust. It was not just quiet, it was starving. My lungs burned with each intake, a sharp, metallic sting that settled in my throat. I glanced at Mia. She was rubbing her arms, her skin flushed with the sudden, biting chill that had descended upon us. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that our breath began to bloom in the light of our flashlights, thick, swirling clouds of white mist that hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. It felt as if the cemetery was leaching the warmth directly from our chests. Liam stumbled, his boot catching on a root, and the sound was muffled, swallowed instantly by the suffocating atmosphere. The pressure in my ears increased, a dull, throbbing weight that made it hard to maintain my balance. We were no longer walking through a graveyard. We were being compressed by the very space around us. The air felt hostile, thick with the weight of something that did not want us to breathe, let alone remain. We picked up our pace, driven by the desperate need to find a space where the air did not feel like a tightening vice. The path ahead finally fractured. We reached the fork, a jagged intersection where the gravel turned to slick, black mud. To the right, a narrow trail wound toward the perimeter fence, still visible under the distant, hazy moonlight. To the left, the ground dipped into a hollow, leading toward the dense, tangled thicket where the nameless graves hid. I swung my light back and forth, the beams clashing against the darkness. Jaden pointed left, his hand trembling. The air in that direction seemed to pool, thick and stagnant, drawing the light into its depths like a drain. We hesitated. The choice hung between us, a heavy, silent weight. Liam took a step toward the right, but his boot slipped on the incline, sliding him back toward the hollow. He caught himself, breath hitching, and looked at me. There was no argument left in any of us. We turned left. As we stepped down into the dip, the ground felt soft, yielding under our weight like rotting fruit. The path narrowed, the trees closing in overhead until the sky vanished completely. We were no longer following a trail. We were being guided by the slope, descending into the dark heart of the cemetery where the soil felt colder and the silence had teeth. The slope leveled out into a hollow that seemed carved out of the earth itself. We stood at the edge of the clearing, our flashlights sweeping over the graves. These were not the tall, ornate markers from the front gate. These were slabs of gray, pitted stone, half buried in the silt. I stepped closer to the nearest one, reaching out to brush away a layer of wet moss. The surface was smooth, worn flat by centuries of rain. No name, no date, no epitaph to claim who rested beneath. I moved to the next, then the next, my light jittering across the rows. Every single marker was a blank slate. It felt as if the history here had been forcibly erased, or perhaps it had never been allowed to exist. The silence in this hollow was different from the rest of the cemetery. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet that made my ears ring. Jaden stood motionless, his light fixed on a cluster of stones that leaned at impossible angles. There was no sense of peace, only a cold, lingering presence that felt ancient and entirely indifferent to our intrusion. The air here did not just feel thin. It felt exhausted, as if the ground had been drained of its vitality long ago. We were standing in a graveyard that had forgotten its own dead, and the realization made my skin crawl with the instinct to flee. The descent continued, but the ground beneath us began to shift. The firm dirt of the path gave way to a soft, spongy depression that sank under every step. It felt as if the earth were hollow, a thin crust stretched over a void. Suddenly, the air pressure spiked. My ears popped, a sharp, internal sting that forced me to stop. I looked at Liam. His jaw was tight, his hand pressed against his chest. Then, the temperature plummeted. It was not a gradual cooling. It was a violent, instant theft of heat. My breath turned into a thick, white plume that hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. Mia shivered, her shoulders hunching forward to protect her neck. I reached out to steady myself against a nearby stone, but the surface was so cold it burned my fingertips, leaving a sting of ice. The silence deepened, becoming so absolute that the sound of my own pulse in my ears felt like a drumbeat. We were no longer walking through a cemetery. We were moving through a space that had been carved out of reality itself. The biting cold crawled under my skin, turning my limbs sluggish. Every nerve ending screamed for us to turn back, but the ground under our feet seemed to tilt, pulling us deeper into the center of the hollow where the air sat still and heavy as lead. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing against our chests until every inhale became a struggle. I looked at Liam, then at Jaden, but their faces were masked by the erratic sweeps of our flashlights. We were paralyzed, anchored by the sheer density of the atmosphere. Then Mia froze. She did not scream, but the sharp intake of her breath cut through the silence like a blade. She pointed toward the ground, her finger trembling as she aimed her light at the damp, dark earth between our feet. I followed the beam. There, pressed clearly into the soft, silt-heavy soil, were footprints. They were not ours. They were small, bare, and impossibly defined. The edges of the indentations were crisp, as if the person who made them had walked past only seconds before. I dropped to one knee, the cold seeping through my trousers, and held my light steady. The prints were not weathered by the damp or filled with debris. They were fresh. The sight was a violent intrusion. It shattered the stillness of the hollow and replaced our confusion with a sharp, jagged spike of alarm. We stood in a circle, our lights converging on the dirt, watching as the reality of a hidden presence manifested in the mud beneath our very toes. I tilted my flashlight, following the line of indentations away from our feet. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The prints did not start at the edge of the path. They emerged directly from the base of the nameless graves. I swept the light back toward us. The trail was unbroken. It bypassed the rocks, wove through the gnarled roots, and ended exactly where my heels rested. Jaden let out a choked, wet sound. Mia backed away, but her foot landed in the soft mud, and she froze. Another print appeared, overlapping her own. The realization hit us with the force of a physical blow. It was not just behind us. It had been walking with us. It was pacing our movements, matching our stride, waiting for us to stop so it could catch up. The air seemed to shrink around us. I looked at Liam, but he was staring at the ground, his face pale and slack. The silence in the hollow was no longer empty. It was occupied. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure against the back of my ankles, a phantom nudge that made me stumble. We were not alone in the dark. We were being hunted by something that had no weight, yet left deep, heavy tracks in the earth. The panic surged, cold and absolute. The terror broke the paralysis. One moment we were rooted in place. The next we were lunging forward. I did not look back. I did not need to. A sharp, dry snap of a twig echoed behind us. Too close, too deliberate. We bolted. My lungs burned as I inhaled the freezing air, gasping in ragged, shallow bursts. Flashlights swung wildly, turning the forest into a strobe of jagged shadows and twisted branches. Jaden tripped, his hand striking the dirt, but he was up again before I could even shout his name. We shoved past the gnarled roots that had seemed so harmless only minutes before. The path was a blur of mud and slick moss under our boots. I could hear Mia sobbing, a desperate, rhythmic sound that matched the frantic pounding of my own heart. Every time I shifted my weight, I felt the phantom pressure of someone breathing against my neck. We were sprinting for survival, legs screaming, muscles twitching with the sheer force of our flight. The cemetery entrance appeared as a sliver of distant, pale light. We pushed harder, our bodies straining against the oppressive weight of the dark. We were not running away from a ghost. We were running away from the end. I hit the iron bars first, my shoulder slamming into the metal with enough force to jar my teeth. It was locked. The heavy chain rattled, a hollow, metallic scream in the night. Liam threw his weight against it, his heels digging into the loose gravel, but the gate did not budge. We were trapped. Behind us, the forest floor groaned. The sound was not wind. It was the slow, methodical crushing of dry leaves, moving toward us with steady, rhythmic intent. I reached for the latch, my fingers trembling, but before I could touch the cold iron, the gate shuddered. It did not swing because of our efforts. It swung wide, pushed by an unseen hand. The metal hinges shrieked in protest, a long, piercing sound that cut through the silence. We stumbled through the gap, not looking back, our momentum carrying us into the safety of the street. I glanced behind me just once. The gate was closing again, pushed shut by that same invisible force, clicking firmly back into place. We stood there on the pavement, gasping, chests heaving, as the cemetery returned to a dead, heavy stillness. The barrier was sealed, but the pressure in the air remained, thick and suffocating. I sprinted until my house became a dark silhouette against the streetlights. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, but my legs buckled as I reached the porch. I grabbed the key, jammed it into the lock, and tumbled inside. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. The silence of the house hit me like a physical weight. It was too quiet. The air inside felt stale, trapped, and unnervingly thin. I leaned my back against the wood of the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird in a cage. I waited for my breath to slow, for the rhythm of my pulse to settle, but the house offered no comfort. The shadows in the hallway seemed deeper than usual, stretching toward me as if they were alive. I reached for the wall, my hand shaking, and felt the surface. It was ice cold. I stood there, listening to the house groan under the pressure of the night. There was no sound of the others, no distant sirens, only the thudding in my ears. I was home, locked away, yet the air felt displaced, as if something else had squeezed into the room with me. The walls were supposed to be my sanctuary, but they felt like a cage. I pushed off the door, my palms slick with cold sweat. I needed to reach the upper floor, to hide where the shadows were familiar. I took the first step, my boot hitting the wood with a sharp, heavy thud that echoed through the empty house. I froze. A smear of dark, wet earth marked the edge of the second riser. I leaned in, my flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the gloom. It was not just one mark. A trail of prints, small and bare, started from the threshold of the front door and tracked directly toward the staircase. Each print was thick with damp, black soil that had not yet begun to dry. My breath hitching in my throat as I traced the line of them with my eyes. They led up. One by one, they climbed, sinking slightly into the grain of the wood. The mud was fresh, glistening in the harsh light of my torch. I stared at the third step, then the fourth. The trail did not stop. It wound upward, disappearing into the darkness of the landing above. The house was no longer empty. Something had walked these stairs, and it was still climbing, leaving the scent of damp earth and rot hanging in the stagnant air of the hallway. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail. It ended at the handle of my bedroom door. The wood felt unnaturally warm under my touch, vibrating with a low, faint frequency that made my teeth ache. I took a steadying breath, but the air refused to fill my lungs. It was thick, viscous, and tasted of stagnant pond water. I pushed. The door groaned on its hinges, resisting as if the room beyond were packed with solid matter. It swung inward, revealing a space that seemed to ripple like heat over pavement. I stepped over the threshold, and the pressure increased instantly. It was a physical weight, a crushing density that forced my shoulders down. The air was displaced, pushed aside by something that occupied the space despite being unseen. I stood frozen in the doorway, my skin prickling under the sudden drop in temperature. There was no movement, yet the atmosphere felt chaotic, churning around me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the empty center of the room, and felt a sharp, static snap against my palm. The space was occupied. I was not alone in the dark, and the room was waiting for me to close the door. My hand found the light switch on the wall. I flicked it up. Nothing happened. I tried it again, snapping the plastic hard against the frame, but the overhead lamp remained cold and dead. The darkness in the room was absolute, heavy enough to feel against my eyelids. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow yellow path through the stagnant air. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling in patterns that defied the draft of the open door. I pointed the beam downward, scanning the floorboards for the trail I had followed from the stairs. The mud was there. The prints continued past the threshold, crossing the hardwood and stopping abruptly in the center of the rug. They did not reach the bed. They did not head toward the window. They simply ended. The final impression of a small, bare heel pressed deep into the fibers. The soil was still wet, dark and glistening under the artificial light. I stood at the edge of the rug, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The silence was absolute, but the air remained displaced, pushed aside by a presence that stood exactly where the tracks ceased. I was trapped in the room with the source of the mud, and the trail went no further. I did not move. I could not move. My muscles felt locked, bonded to the floorboards by the sheer weight of the presence in the room. Then, the sound began. It was a slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy being pulled across the wood. It started near the foot of the bed and moved left, the rhythm steady and agonizingly patient. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It followed the perimeter of my mattress, circling the frame with a precision that suggested intent. I stood in the center of the room, my breath shallow, listening as the sound passed inches behind me. It was not the sound of feet. It was the sound of something dragging its own weight, an uneven, wet friction against the floor. I tried to lift my leg, but the air felt like hardening resin, holding me in place. The circle continued, again and again, a clockwork loop of psychological erosion. I kept my eyes pinned to the ceiling, refusing to look down at the floor, terrified that if I broke the rhythm of my stare, the dragging would stop and something would rise. The hours crawled forward, marked only by the repetitive scrape against the grain of the wood. The sun was a distant, unreachable concept. I waited for dawn, paralyzed by the patient, circular march that refused to end. The first light hit the window, pale and cold. I looked down at the rug. The mud was gone. The fibers were clean, as if nothing had ever touched them. I checked my shoes, my clothes, the floorboards. No trace remained. The silence of the morning felt fragile, a thin film over the exhaustion that pulled at my eyes. I sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the terror to lift, but it remained, coiled in the corners of the room. Then, the phone on my bedside table erupted. The ring was sharp, discordant, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. I snatched the receiver. Liam was on the other end, his voice shaking. He did not say hello. He only asked if I had found the mud in my hallway. Before I could answer, the line crackled with a sound like dragging wood. I hung up, but the phone rang again instantly. It was Jaden, breathing hard, shouting about his closet door swinging wide. Then, a third call. Mia. She was crying, describing a rhythmic tapping against her bedroom glass that would not cease. The terror was no longer contained within my four walls. It was shifting, expanding, reaching out to the others. We were connected by the noise, by the shared, impossible history of that night in the cemetery. The dragging sound was not gone. It had simply found new ground to cover. We opened a group line, the static on the call pulsating like a heartbeat. Liam spoke first, his words frantic. He was standing in his hallway, staring at a smear of damp earth that was slowly lengthening across the floorboards. Jaden interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. His closet door was not just open, it was vibrating against the frame, hit by a rhythmic, heavy impact from the inside. Mia began to sob. She held her phone to the bedroom glass so we could hear. Tap, tap, tap. A deliberate, metallic strike against the pane, despite the window being locked from the inside. I looked at my own floor. The wood was bowing, the boards groaning under a weight that left no footprint. We were all trapped in the same loop, separated by miles but bound by the exact same physical intrusion. The air in my room turned biting, the temperature plummeting until my breath clouded. Across the line, they felt the same, sudden, sharp frost. The entity was not moving between us. It was occupying us all. We heard the same dragging sound, a synchronized friction that echoed through all four receivers at once. It had stopped hunting. It had claimed us. The panic eventually exhausted itself, replaced by a dull, pulsing rhythm that defined our nights. We stopped calling. We stopped searching for exits. The haunting had settled into the foundation of our lives, as fixed as the floorboards themselves. Every night, the house begins to groan. It is not the sound of settling wood or shifting temperature. It is the distinct, rhythmic protest of timber bending under a weight that does not register on a scale. I lie in the dark, my gaze fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the first tremor to travel through the floor. It starts in the hallway, a slow, deliberate pressure that moves from one plank to the next. The wood shrieks, a low-frequency vibration that rattles the glass in my window frames. It is a nightly labor, a patient, tireless pacing that never reaches a destination. I watch the shadows stretch and retreat as the weight passes by my door. There is no escape from the sound. It is a permanent feature of the air, a physical burden that demands attention. The floorboards are wearing thin from the constant, invisible tread. Each common night, the groan is deeper, the wood closer to snapping under the pressure of a visitor that refuses to leave. The pacing has changed. The floorboards no longer hold the full weight of the visitor. The rhythm has migrated. It moved from the hallway to the door, and now it clings to the edge of the mattress. I feel the bed frame quiver, a subtle rhythmic dipping of the springs that mirrors the pace of the dragging sound. It is slow, deliberate. The mattress sinks inches from my hip, then shifts again, closer to my shoulder. My eyes are wide, fixed on the darkness above, but the air is thick with the sensation of displacement. Something is resting its weight against the side of the bed. The sound of dragging, that faint, dry friction, is now right beside my ear. It is not moving away. It is not searching for a path. It has found the destination. I hold my breath, listening to the shallow, ragged displacement of air that does not belong to me. The weight shifts again, pressing into the cushion directly behind my head. There is no more floor to pace. There is only the pillow, the dark, and the patient, heavy stillness of something that refused to stay behind. I wait, eyes open, as the mattress dips one last time.